My name is Alexander Sikorsky, and I'm the membership director of the Buckley program. Thank you all for coming. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to say a few quick words about the Buckley program. The Buckley program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We host lectures, debates, and conferences with guests who hold views that diverge from campus orthodoxy and challenge Yale students on their principles. To freshmen, upperclassmen, and grad students who are not yet involved with the Buckley program, I highly recommend that you visit buckleyprogram.com to learn more about becoming a Buckley Fellow. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to any pre-frost joining us today for Bulldog Days. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our guests. Oren Cass is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he focuses on energy, the environment, and anti-poverty policy. He was domestic policy director of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2011 and 2012, and in that role, Cass shaped campaign policy and communication on issues from healthcare to energy to trade. He spoke regularly on behalf of the campaign, including in debates at Harvard University on healthcare policy and at MIT on energy and environmental policy. Since then, Mr. Cass has outlined conservative policy approaches on poverty, climate change, environmental regulation, and international trade. Mr. Cass has briefed members of Congress and congressional staff in both the House and Senate, and his essays and columns have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the National Review, among other places. Today, Mr. Cass will discuss climate change catastrophism and how not to worry about climate change. The Buckley program is honored to be hosting Oren Cass this afternoon. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all very much. People in the back, come on in. There's lots of seats in the front row, even some further back. Thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here at Yale. I actually use a lot of Yale's work on climate change because you have a center on climate communication. And in a sense, what I want to talk about is how we communicate about climate change and the different ways that people think about it. So this is not a discussion about climate science. I'll put up some references to what's called the IPCC, which is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just to give a sense of kind of what the scientific consensus is. But what I want to talk about is how we think about what that science means for us as a society. So it's fine to have the science that tells us what is likely to happen to temperatures, how that will affect the natural environment. But to know what that means for humanity and what that means for public policy, we need to know how that mapping from environmental changes to social changes is done. And that's not something the science can actually tell us. That comes down to a lot of politics and economics. So to start with, there's actually a Yale study last year, Climate Change in the American Mind. And what it found was roughly 30 to 37% of Americans either don't believe in climate change or believe that it's happening, but it's primarily caused by natural forces. It also found that 38% think it's more likely than not that climate change will cause the extinction of humankind. Now, of those two positions, I would say both of them are wildly wrong, but they're at least equally wildly wrong. And at this point, we have at least as much a problem of people wildly overestimating the threat posed by climate change as we do of people underestimating it. Now, why might that be the case? Well, because we have a lot of people saying things like this. Margaret Heatherman, Scientific American, there's no telling how the devastation will play out. Regions may become uninhabitable and the world ungovernable. Ryan Cooper at The Week, it could quite literally threaten the existence of the United States and, needless to say, kill billions in poorer nations. Or as David Roberts of Vox put it, 2100 will be simply hell on earth. We, of course, remember our former president describing climate change as an existential threat and saying no challenge poses a greater threat to future generations. And Bernie Sanders, who actually in one of the Democratic debates said the planet that we're going to be leaving our kids and our grandchildren may well not be habitable. There's just no basis for saying these things. This is what I call climate catastrophism. And I think it's interesting to look at how this contrasts with the actual science. So what does the IPCC say? The IPCC says we should expect about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the year 2100 if we don't do anything about our greenhouse gas emissions. The estimated effect on sea level rises is about 2 feet. You may have heard about cities becoming flooded and uninhabitable. The actual estimated sea level rise is about 2 feet, and most of that isn't even from the melting of glaciers or Antarctica or Greenland. Most of it's just from water expanding as it gets warmer. It's actually expected to take centuries more before we see the kinds of more extreme sea level rise that would be associated with significant loss in Greenland or Antarctica. They also look at ecosystems and say ecosystem loss should be comparable with land use change to date, meaning the effects of ecosystems on ecosystems from climate change should actually be pretty similar to what humanity has already done to ecosystems. Now, I'm not here to say that's a good thing. Certainly there have been a lot of costs to a variety of species, and in some cases to humans as well, but it has not threatened our existence as a society or made it hell on earth. If you go from the IPCC then to costs, actually the most important work done to date on the economic cost of climate change also comes from Yale, from Professor William Nordhaus. And he created a model that tried to estimate the economic cost of climate change. This was one of the 3 models used by the Obama administration when it made its so-called social cost of carbon. And it was actually the highest case model. So of the models the Obama administration used to estimate the global cost of climate change, this is the most extreme one. This is about what Nordhaus estimated global GDP would look like without climate change. So rising from 70 trillion in 2015 up toward 500 trillion by the end of the century. And this is with climate change. Now, depending on how you look at it, you could say that that is a very substantial cost. In the year 2100, that's about $20 trillion. And so if you said $20 trillion a year, that's a lot of money. That would be fair. But if you look at it over the time period, you also have to admit it doesn't look that overwhelming. Certainly not like hell on earth. Because besides looking at it as 20 trillion in 2100, you could also look at it as just postponing our prosperity by a few years. The line's still going up. By about 2103, we'd be about where we were supposed to be in 2100. You could also look at it about how much better we are off than today. This is about 6.5 times wealthier a world instead of 6.7 times wealthier a world. Or you could look at it as an annual growth rate. This is, instead of a 2.27% annual growth rate, about a 2.22 annual growth rate. Now, that's not nothing. That's a real cost, but it's not different in scope from the kinds of costs we think about in any other area of policy, whether you're talking about tax, education, foreign policy. Anything that you're concerned about could have at least this much effect over the course of a century. The EPA did its own analysis and tried to identify for the United States all of the costs it thought were going to be associated with climate change. One cost overwhelmed all the others. They found about 1.3 trillion of total costs in 2100. More than 900 billion of that came from air pollution. Now, that's not all the air pollution associated with fossil fuels. This is the slightly higher levels of air pollution we would expect when it's slightly warmer. It makes it slightly easier for ozone to form. You get a little bit more particulate matter. And so what this chart is showing is the effect they forecasted for 2100. So ozone goes from 82 parts per billion in 2000, or I'm sorry, yes, that's right, parts per billion, down to 69 in 2015. So we were making incredible progress. Assume no further progress for the next 100 years, it would go back up to about 72 by 2100. Particulate matter from 13 down to 8 in the last 15 years. Assume no more progress for the rest of the century, and then up to about 10. So again, still better environmental quality than even 10 or 15 years ago, and this was the primary cost to the United States from climate change. 57,000 lives per year valued at $930 billion. That is certainly not nothing. That's a real cost we should be aware of and consider. But again, it is not hell on earth. So why do people look at these facts and come to such different conclusions? There is actually a lot of work done now in what is called climate psychology, which is focused primarily on the idea of trying to understand why people aren't scared enough of climate change. I think they're wrong to focus on the scared enough, but what they look at, I think, is actually right, which is to say, what are the things that people who feel one way about climate change are thinking differently about than people who think the other way? And I would say there are three in particular. One is how do we think about costs in the distance? One is how do we think about costs that are occurring slowly over time? And one is how do we think about speculative costs? How do we think about extreme cases that we have no idea whether or not they're going to happen? So I want to walk through those and think about how we think about them. So first of all, costs in the distance. One of the reasons climate change doesn't look scary from this perspective is because by the time that it happens, we are expected to be so much more wealthy and technologically advanced than we are today. And we already see those things going on. We see India building millions of irrigation ponds to cope with variations in the monsoon. It's hard to believe India will be less prepared to cope with variations in the monsoon 100 years from now than they are today. You can see Israel with its desalination technology actually now has a surplus of water in the middle of the drought that has afflicted the Middle East. Desalination undoubtedly will only improve, as will water management generally, over the course of the century. The same goes for natural disasters. Bangladesh in the 1970s saw what was classified as a Category 6 typhoon, the strongest level. It killed 500,000 people. In the 1990s, they had another one. It killed about 100,000. In 2010, they had another one. It killed about 4,000. Now, what happened wasn't some miraculous typhoon-defeating technology. It was that they actually built concrete bunkers and established a warning system. It's hard to believe that Bangladesh won't be even much more prepared over the decades to come. And then the same also goes for something like health. So one thing you'll hear is that tropical diseases will become more widespread. And there are various effects on human health. Turns out if you look progressively over time, the United States has seen its death rate from infectious diseases fall by about a factor of 10 over the course of this century. And as other countries get richer, they follow that same trajectory. Now, you know who actually has a lower infectious disease rate, death rate already in the United States? Costa Rica, in the middle of the tropics. One reason for that is because you don't have to deal with a lot of influenza in the tropics. But if you think then, okay, what is climate change going to feel like? Not today, but in 2100, costs that would feel very severe if they happened tomorrow don't start to look so bad. If you assume that nothing's going to change, and the world that faces climate change is going to be this world, things look a lot worse. The second effect, costs over time. One story you'll often hear is the story about the boiling frog. You throw a boiling frog into a pot of, you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, it hops right out. You let a frog sit in a pot of water and slowly heat it, and it will die without even noticing. Turns out it's not true. If you put a frog in a pot of water and heat it, it will hop out when it gets uncomfortable. And if you throw a frog in a pot of boiling water, you will grievously injure it. The one thing worse than a slow-moving crisis is a fast-moving crisis. And a lot of the costs that you hear associated with climate change are one-time costs spread over the entirety of the time period that climate change will happen. So let me give you an example. You hear a lot about climate refugees. And I think that's one of the very real and larger problems we are going to see from climate change. Hundreds of millions of climate refugees. If you spread that over 100 years, though, if as the climate changes, different groups are disrupted over time, you're actually only talking about a few million people a year. And obviously, each of those is an individual tragedy. In some cases, it's a tragedy for an entire community. But it's a fairly small fraction of the refugees and migrants we already have every year. We have more than 60 million refugees worldwide. We have more than 200 million internal migrants within China alone, about 300 million international migrants around the world. And the World Bank says that by 2050, we should expect to see about 2.5 billion people move to cities. In that context, the problem caused by climate change is going to be another incremental factor on top of that. But it's certainly not going to be outside the scope of what we've seen over the last century. It's certainly not going to be something outside the scope of what our geopolitical system can handle. And it's certainly not going to be hell on earth. One more example I'll give is agriculture. You hear a lot of concern about what's going to happen to our food systems. What if, let's say, half of our agricultural production goes out the window as the climate shifts? That sounds massive. Over 100 years, that's about 0.5% a year. And over the last 50 years, as world population exploded, we increased our production about 2.5% a year. So we already know how to expand agricultural production about 5 times faster than we would have to bring agricultural production online to cope with climate change. And among other things, we know that global population is not going to be growing this century the way that it did in the last. So again, if you think of climate change as something that is going to happen all at once and land on us, it can sound incredibly scary. If you think of something that's going to happen a little bit, year over year, for a very long period of time, the effects start to sound not so bad. And what we're talking about ultimately when we talk about that overtime effect is adaptation. The idea that human society adapts to the conditions around it, including to the climate. Now, we don't adapt perfectly. It's certainly not free to adapt. But we also don't stand frozen in place. The argument made by climate catastrophists is akin to the image, I don't know if there are any fans of What Lies Beneath here. Harrison Ford, Michelle Pfeiffer, he paralyzes her in the bathtub and then leaves the water running. It's pretty scary. The water is slowly rising in the bathtub and she's paralyzed and watching it rise and she's going to drown. If you imagine climate change in those terms, frozen in place as the changes occur, it does in fact seem horrifying. But life is not a horror movie, and we are not paralyzed. So how do we adapt? Well, one way is just basic biophysical adaptation. We get used to different climates. Everyone knows that feeling of being in a hot place and going to a cold place or vice versa. That's not just a cliched thing. Humans actually adapt to their local temperatures. We adapt behaviorally. If there's anyone here from the South who's been involved in one of those embarrassing Atlanta pile-ups when there's half an inch of snow, that's because you don't know how to drive in the snow. If you got a lot of snow every year, you would figure out how to drive in the snow. Another is technological. You'd probably get new tires too. And more generally, we develop and deploy technologies in response to the conditions we face. In the South, we've developed air conditioning. We benefit from it up here as well, though not in this room at the moment. But air conditioning, the best evidence suggests, has reduced heat-related mortality by about 80% in the last 50 years. If you extrapolate that trend line, the idea that people are going to be dying because it's too hot is very difficult to believe. We also adapt socially. You have a siesta in the middle of the day if you need one. We don't play baseball in the winter in New Haven. Those are things that happen. And again, those things aren't free. Places that used to enjoy playing, let's say, soccer in the middle of the summer, if they find it too hot to do that, that will be a loss. But it is not the case that that is outside the scope of the kind of thing that humans know how to deal with. And then finally, we adapt economically. We shift economic production around. We specialize in different things. And if you're talking about over the course of decades or centuries, the economy adapts and responds to the incentives it faces far more quickly than the climate change is expected to happen. Now, some of you are thinking, yes, but obviously we know about adaptation. And so I'm here to tell you that one of the most surprising things about climate economics, and anything you read that tells you about how costly and damaging climate change is going to be, is it in fact begins from an assumption of no adaptation. If you read the study, it will say, we assume no adaptation. If you read the New York Times write-up of the study, and you get down to like the 19th paragraph, it will say, of course, this assumes no adaptation, and maybe adaptation will happen. And to give you an idea of how extreme this is the most prominent study that catastrophists like to cite. It was published in Nature in 2015, Global Nonlinear Effect of Temperature on Economic Production. Some economists thought, gosh, we wouldn't have to mess around with all this actually defining what climate change does to the world. If we could just show that warmer temperatures are bad for economic growth, then that line from the Nordhaus chart would flatten out and climate change would look catastrophic. So they did this. They got a nice write-up in the Washington Post, sweeping study, claims rising temperatures will sharply cut economic growth. World Economic Forum gushed over the breath of fresh air and deep insight they brought. Here's what they did. I apologize, this chart looks complex, and I should say I've lifted it directly from their article, but it actually depicts what they did very well. They looked at each country's economic growth each year since 1960. And said, what was the relationship between variations in temperature from the average and variations in economic growth? And so you see some examples down here at the bottom. On the far left, Iceland, their economic growth was a little bit higher when it was warmer. France, maybe higher, not much of an effect. United States, relatively flat. Vietnam, down. Mali, way down. And they said maybe this is just a globally universal effect. There's an ideal temperature from our statistical analysis of 13 degrees Celsius. When your temperature in a given year brings you warmer than 13 degrees Celsius, your growth goes down. If you're below 13 and you warm up, your economic growth goes up. Now, I should say, none of this is anywhere close to being statistically significant by any normal test. But this was the relationship they found. And so then they did the effect for each country. So here's how this plays out for the United States. Right now, we're right at about 13 degrees Celsius. So we have great growth. If the temperature warms 4 degrees Celsius, our growth each year should be about 2% lower than it otherwise would be. So they could take the estimated growth for the century, and then you see the growing wedge between black and red is the growing decline in growth as it warms. And so then you get an effect on per capita income. Red line with climate change lower than black line without it. You do this for every country, and you can show that climate change is going to reduce global income by about 25%. That would be massive. It's an order of magnitude bigger than what the Obama administration found. But here's what happens when you do that study for that same analysis for Iceland. Goes from being very cold to not quite so cold. Get a nice big wedge of rising economic growth thanks to climate change. If you look closely at the axis over on the right, you'll see that Iceland, instead of getting to about 100K per capita of income, gets to 1.5 million per capita of income, becoming the wealthiest country in the world. Here is the United States. China and India never really grow. They just become poor. By 2100, India is shrinking at 4% per year. Mongolia, on the other hand, reaches, now again, I'm not claiming to do any analysis here. This is just me taking some charts shown in logarithmic form in their study and showing it in a little easier to read format. There's Mongolia, 400K, and there's Iceland, 1.5 million. So Iceland and Finland become the world's richest countries. Canada's economy becomes 7 times larger than China's. India becomes the world's poorest country, shrinking at 4% per year. This was published in Nature, cited in those places, and you'll now read it, just mentioned in passing in various articles, as this one showed, in fact, climate change could cost as much as 20% of GDP, with worst cases even worse. Now, why might this not be true? Ultimately, because it assumes other things equal when other things are not equal. The basic mode of economic analysis for all at modern economics is we run a study, we run a bunch of regressions, and we try to hold everything constant to find the effect of one thing. If we want to find the effect of a Yale degree, we throw all of the variables in and then check Yale degree versus other degree and get something the admissions department that can use that shows how much higher your income will be with a Yale degree. Not life satisfaction, but income. If you use that to tell you how much higher your income would be in the year 2100 with a Yale degree, you'd say that's probably a pretty unhelpful study. But that's how climate change studies are done. They likewise assume, therefore, no adaptation. They assume the response to small, random changes can be extrapolated to large, gradual changes, and they assume that extremely weak correlations have very strong predictive power. I have to show you one more. This is from the EPA study I was telling you about. I showed you their biggest cost was that tiny change in air pollution. Next biggest cost, people dropping like flies from heat-related deaths. Now, how did they do that? They took each city and they said, let's look at the distribution of temperatures for the city over the course of a year. And let's define the hottest 1% of temperatures as extreme heat and the coldest 1% as extreme cold. And let's see how many more people die on extremely hot days. And more people do die on extremely hot days. That's true. But then they added climate change. With climate change, the temperature would be a little bit hotter every day. It's the year 2100 now. And now look at extreme heat. Wow, look how much bigger the red area is than the blue area. So if Pittsburgh's ability to cope with warmer temperatures didn't change at all, and Pittsburgh got warmer, people would be dying in Pittsburgh about 75 times faster than they die right now in Phoenix. Even though Phoenix, of course, is already hotter than Pittsburgh would be at the end of the century. Now, this is on the EPA website. Again, I didn't do any analysis here. I'm just making the chart. But if you do this, you can create some very, very large death totals. I would be willing to bet that the Pittsburgh number in 2100 will be about 0.17, if not lower. So I think that's two things that people get very wrong about climate change, is they're assuming no adaptation, and they're forgetting how far in the future this is, and they're therefore saying, gosh, this is going to be a massive impact we're not ready for, and it's going to happen all at once. The third thing, which I think is a fairer point, but still not a good one, is what if things get really bad? I've told you what kind of the best estimate for climate change is, but we don't know. What if it gets much worse? What if what's the movie where New York freezes all of a sudden the day after tomorrow? What if that happens? You can't prove it's not going to happen. So here's Michael Mann. He's a well-known climate scientist. He blocked me on Twitter and called what I've just presented to you #Coke climate denial propaganda. But here's what he says. Maybe it is true what the modelers have been telling us, that it will take 1,000 years for Greenland to melt. But maybe they're wrong. Maybe it could play out in a century or two, and then it's a whole different ballgame. Now, notice the move that's being made here. The argument is no longer to listen to the scientific consensus and respond to what the science is telling us. The argument is that the scientific consensus could be completely wrong. The models could be completely wrong, and we should be ready for that. And I actually think that's a fair point as far as it goes, as long as you don't pretend also that that's what the scientific consensus says. So the first two parts we talked about with respect to adaptation is in line with the scientific consensus. But how would we have a discussion about this worst case? What if something that we don't think is going to happen happens? We actually have a lot of those in our lives. They're what I would call worrying problems. They're tailor-made to worry about. And they have three elements. One element is they're forecasted versus immediate, right? Think about a typical problem like skyrocketing college debt. We can go out and ask each of you, how much debt do you have, and is that a problem? We can't do that with climate change. We're guessing. Second problem, it's irreversible instead of static. Most problems, even if we can't see them now, by the time we get to them, we can deal with them then. So maybe we are going to have a shortage of elderly care specialists. And when that happens, we can train more elderly care specialists. Once climate change happens, if day after tomorrow happens, it's too late to say, oh, well, let's stop fossil fuels. So that's a real problem. And then the third is that it's pervasive as opposed to confined. And what I mean by that is consider the extinction of an animal. Right? If I tell you that some bird species is going to go extinct, I'm forecasting a problem. It's irreversible if it happens. It might be really tragic, but what else does it really affect? Climate change, the idea is it's going to affect everything. Right? We live in the climate. You can take absolutely any human behavior and link it to climate change, and that's part of what scares people. But there are a lot of worrying problems, and we don't deal with them the way we talk about climate change. There are a lot of biological worrying problems, pandemics, bioterror, superbugs, resistant to antibiotics. There are a lot of social ones, financial meltdowns because of our interconnected economic system, urbanization, fundamentalism. There are technological ones, artificial intelligence, cyber terror. All of these things actually have these same characteristics. And the way that we deal with them is not to run around and set our hair on fire about all of them all at once. For one thing, we don't have enough energy. But it also wouldn't be rational. The way that we deal with them is to study them, to build up our resilience to them, and to try to make sure that we're doing as best we can to cope with them, if and when they happen. And the other really nice thing is I would say climate change is less worrying than any of them. Right? It's an interesting question. You have all of these vague, forecasted, indeterminate problems. If you had to rank them, how would you? Here's how I would rank them. One, how big is the worst case impact? There are worst case impacts out there that truly are like humanity goes extinct. Climate change isn't one of them. Oxford University does a big conference every so often on extinction level threats, and they talk about nanotechnology, rogue nanotechnology, and bioterror, and climate change doesn't make their survey list of something that could even plausibly have that level of impact. Climate change is less irreversible because it's so slow. If climate change starts to get worse, then you still have another decade or 2 decades to figure out how you're going to respond. If a lot of these things happen, it's like 2 weeks and that's the end of that. So I like that it's slow. And the third is that it's pervasive, but in a very disconnected way. And what I mean by that is, let's go back to the Syria example, which I mentioned very briefly when I mentioned that Israel is also facing the same drought in the Middle East. You will hear people say, here you could have heard our former president say, you know, there's this research that says that droughts that happened in Syria contributed to the civil war, and if you start magnifying that across a lot of states with poor people, imagine what you'd get. That's fair, but as I said, Israel faced the exact same drought. The difference between Israel and Syria is not climate, it's institutions, it's technology, it's an economy, might be cultural to some extent. Those things all intermediate between climate and impacts. And to the extent that we control those and make progress on those over the coming century, whatever happens with climate change won't be nearly as bad. I always like to cross out the word droughts here and write in Islamic fundamentalism, because the paragraph actually reads much better. And I think it's a fair question to ask if we're going to be musing about how a drought could have contributed to this, and what if over 100 years climate change did that to the whole world. I would want to ask first whether we're worried that Syria and the Syrian civil war and a lot of states that have a lot of poor people on the margin of survival, I think fundamentalism might actually be a much bigger security issue. So why the divide? Why do people think about it differently? You might, well, let's just all be rational and think about it the same way. I think a little bit of it is just innate. People look at all sorts of problems differently. Part of this has been around since the start of the environmental movement. The population bomb and fear of overpopulation in the 1960s. It's the exact same problem. What if all the trend lines continue and we don't do anything? Everyone would have, in fact, starved to death. But we did do something. 1970s, limits to growth. Peak oil in the 1980s. Same thing over and over again. If you extrapolate the trends and assume that no one reacts, things always look very bad. And that's never how it plays out. And then finally, I think there's motivated reasoning. And I mention this because there's motivated reasoning on both sides. It is very popular to say that people who deny climate change or are skeptical of climate change are thinking that way because they don't like the solutions. That might be true to some extent for some people. But to the extent it's true, I think it's probably equally true that the people who want to set their hair on fire about climate change and insist that it's the most important thing that we all do whatever they say to do right away about, happen to really like the policy implications of climate change. And one way you can tell is that as soon as they don't like the policy implication anymore, the climate change fear suddenly goes away. So for instance, Washington State had a referendum on a carbon tax. Sierra Club opposed it, voted down really by a coalition from the left because they didn't feel it was socially inclusive enough a campaign, and because the revenue from the carbon tax was going to go to other tax reductions instead of to new government investments. More broadly, nuclear power. Environmentalists are coming around on nuclear power, but we still see a lot of people trying to shut down nuclear power plants in the United States. And it's awfully hard to take serious concern about climate change when you're simultaneously shutting down our largest, most reliable source of zero carbon power. So what should we do? I'll close with just a couple of quick comments on what would a more rational view be. If you said climate change is happening, it's going to cause some real problems, but we also shouldn't set our hair on fire or shut down our economy or hand over all power to a series of regulators over it, what would you do? Well, the first thing you do is invest in technology, because at the end of the day, actually reducing global emissions is going to come down to what the developing world uses. It's a lot bigger than we are, it's growing a lot faster, it's building its energy infrastructure, and as long as fossil fuels are the best way to do that, they will use them. And as soon as we can find something cheaper, or they can find something cheaper, they will use that. And it is in all of our interest to be investing in finding those things. We can do better preparation. I would love to see a little bit of the energy spent on fanciful how the US can get to 100% renewable power in the next 5 years. Let's take a little bit of that energy and instead have an exercise. What if we knew sea level was going to rise 10 feet in the next 10 years? What would Manhattan do? Right? I mean, we wouldn't just give up and go home. We'd do something. So what would it be? And if we actually went through that exercise, We would both learn what the biggest risks are in what order as sea level rises, and we'd learn exactly what kinds of responses we'd have and how much they'd cost. And then we'd have something to move forward toward. We can invest in resilience. We can actually have building codes that are resistant to stronger storms. We can have crops that are resistant to droughts. We can have better water management in the developing world. We have better incentives because so much of adaptation is private, not public. Adaptation is the result of people responding rationally to the world around them. And as long as we bail people out for doing things that are going to get more and more costly with climate change, they will continue to do them. If we make it clear that actually paying attention to the threats of climate change is the rational thing to do, then mayors, when they're making infrastructure investment, private developers, when they're deciding where to build, energy companies, everyone can react to that if they have the right incentives. And then finally, we should keep doing research, because the more we understand about the problem, the better job we can do adapting, and the better job we can do in identifying anything that really isn't just a worrying problem, but is going to happen, and start responding. And that is how not to worry about climate change. Thank you very much.
For Mr. Cass, if you have a question, I'll come around with a mic.
Hi, Mr. Cass. I really enjoyed your presentation. So I've encountered a lot of students here at Yale who refuse to, they treat climate change as sort of like a sacrosanct issue, right? Like if you don't believe climate change is the biggest threat to mankind, then I won't speak to you. Or even if you don't think climate change is 100% anthropogenic, I won't, they'll shoot you down in an almost like type of religious way, right? I've experienced that in a couple classes I've taken on climate change. So how do we, I know you sort of mentioned a little bit, right? But how can you reason with people who refuse to have a debate on this climate change issue? Like, how would you do it if you're one-on-one?
Well, so you can't have a debate with someone who refuses to debate. That's the first thing I'd say. And so something I learned in college was picking your battles is actually very important. Some people you aren't going to persuade. But there are people who I think are actively interested in having a discussion. And there I think there are two things that are really helpful. One is starting with an agreement on the science. Right? Part of the reason we have this polarized climate debate is you have one side saying some of the things I was describing, and the other side saying, like, no, it's sunspots or a Chinese hoax or whatever else. And so I think some of the people who are, and let's keep in mind, the people who say they're scared about climate change are really scared about climate change. Right? I think there's a lot of kind of lobbying of like everyone's just being disingenuous, and hopefully that's not what my comments suggested. I think the people who are scared absolutely feel that way and are scared. And there are now climate grief counseling groups. I'm just telling you things there are. I'm not endorsing them. Tragically, I believe it was some kind of public interest lawyer in New York City set himself on fire, committed ritual suicide over climate change last week, a couple of weeks ago. So people are very upset. But step one is to say, look, I'm not here to fight with you about the science. Let's make sure we're talking about the same science, because almost invariably neither of you is a climate scientist. So can we agree that what the IPCC said is accurate and the starting point? And if so, if not, well, okay, I don't know what else to tell you. But if so, then let's actually talk about some concrete impacts. What do you think, what is climate change going to do? And that's a very interesting question. A lot of times, and this is, I think, common with environmentalism generally, the so what is just assumed, right? You make a statement, well, if we damage ecosystems, that is per se bad. Now, that's a value system, and you can have an interesting debate about that value system. But a lot of the rationale around climate change is just climate change is per se bad. And part of the fear of climate change is the belief that things that the human footprint on the Earth is a negative one, and that more growth and prosperity, first of all, just must have a downside. And in fact, the specific downside it has is it's going to cause environmental calamity. And climate change is the current iteration of that. So people instinctively believe that, but then you're left with the question, okay, no, but what's actually going to do? Are people going to be dying from heat? Because we can have a discussion about that. There's plenty of good evidence. Are people not going to be able to work? Plenty of good evidence about that. Is it going to destroy ecosystems? Plenty of good evidence about that. We can talk about those things. And maybe there are some particular ones they're really worried about. Maybe they come from a low-lying island. Though interestingly, as the New York Times just reported, a long, multi-decade study of low-lying islands in the Pacific showed that as sea level has been rising, they've been getting bigger. Because you get different tidal patterns and you have the reefs there. They're not quite sure why, but in fact, the low-lying islands are not shrinking as the tide rises. So you can have conversations about these things. But I think as long as it's a climate change eek, that's an emotional response. And that you're not really going to have a debate about.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Cameron. I'm going to be a freshman next year. Yeah, I'm doing Bulldog Days now. But I kind of have two things, and then if you want to pick one or if you have time to address
he hasn't
both.
learned not to ask two questions yet.
Is this a cardinal sin?
You can. If you ask two questions, the speaker will typically only answer the easier one.
That's a fair point. All right, I'll see what you do. So the first point that I just want to bring up very quickly is that when you had the slide of what Obama said about the exacerbation of terrorism as a result of climate change, I mean, clearly the State Department has said that climate change poses a national security threat. I mean, that's been quoted from the State Department. So I just wonder if you could. Was it the Defense Department? Okay, well, the prominent figures in the federal government who are not who I don't think would accept kind of the casualness with which you dismiss the president's comments. That was my first kind of comment to bring up. And the second one is that when you discuss basically what happens if what you're saying is wrong, and people who bring up, we really only have one planet on which to run this experiment. The other examples that you bring up with, bioterrorism and these other types of things don't really have that same quality of that type of argument to them, because climate change, as the vast majority of climate scientists agree, is caused by human behavior, or at least that's a predominant cause in climate change. Whereas, bioterrorism, the ways that we would go to address that isn't radically changing the behavior of a society. So if, we kind of implement that like Pascal's wager type logic, this is the only experiment we have to run, kind of let's rather be safe than sorry, why doesn't that logic apply to the climate change debate? Okay. Thanks.
I'll try to hit both quickly. So the Defense Department, anyone who's curious, I recommend you go read the language. The Defense Department acknowledges or identifies climate change as a threat, which I think is true. I mean, everything from like sea level rise affects where your ports are to potential effects of migration. It certainly doesn't say it's an existential threat. It certainly doesn't say it's the biggest threat we face. Certainly doesn't say it threatens humanity or the United States as an organized community. So I can't tell you whether those people who wrote that would disagree with me. I can say I don't disagree with them. With respect to those other things you raised, those other things are obviously all human-caused also. I think, right, I mean, and it's an interesting question, okay, but if you wanted to eliminate the risk of those things, what would you have to do? And one of the reasons they're worrying problems is because we can't eliminate the risk of them because they are society-wide. I mean, let's say you wanted to eliminate the risk of bioterror. What would you have to do? You'd have to shut down the world's biological research programs, which is actually kind of similar in scope to saying we should shut down the world's economic development via fossil fuels. If you wanted to eliminate the risk of pandemic, which actually is natural, you'd have to shut down international air travel. I mean, it's an interesting question. Why don't we have a pandemic tax, just like a carbon tax, that takes the risk of pandemic and chops it up into every little marginal amount, which would be every bit as plausible as pretending that each ton of carbon dioxide raises the risk by the same amount. And let's have a tax on every international flight to try to make sure we internalize the risk of pandemic that we're increasing. That sounds like a crazy, nonsensical thing to do, but that I would argue is essentially what we're doing with climate change. And so I do think that they are relatively parallel. Certainly there are things that are unique about climate change. There are things that are unique about any of them. But in how we as society and how policymakers in particular should approach it, I think you face the same problem of a Pascal's wager and a kind of precautionary principle, and the same need to kind of step back and say, we can't shut all these things down entirely, but we can certainly prepare for them. You're a junior?
A junior, yeah. Thank you. We used to talk about this as global warming, and then that was too controversial, so now it's climate change. But I would submit that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The continents used to be one landmass called Pangaea. They separated out about 180 million years ago. We've always had change. It still is used as a sort of alarmist term, and it's just change. We need more perspective. And I think that's, overall, that's what your talk was about, the perspective.
Yeah, I mean, let me say something. Well, so first of all, I think the whole global warming climate change thing gets a bad rap. Certainly the activist community has switched from one to the other. Scientists actually use both, and they actually have precise meanings. Global warming is the rise in temperature, and climate change is the associated environmental effects. So for instance, heat-related deaths would be an effect of global warming. Sea level rise would be an example of climate change. It is true that obviously we've always had climate change. We've always had all kinds of geological change. I do think it's important to be careful in one respect, which is the speed of the change, and specifically the fact that we are here to experience the change. I mean, let's say you told me the 7 continents were going to recombine into one over 100 years while we're here. Like, I would say that's really bad. Even, right, the fact that, well, but there used to be one, a billion years ago wouldn't really make me feel any better. And so, there's also a related argument, well, what's the ideal temperature? Why isn't warmer better than cooler? Similar thing, which is, that's right in the abstract. If you were starting from 0, you could pick a warmer temperature. But we have built all of our human infrastructure and society at the temperature we're at. And so I think the tension we face isn't, is change good? I think, on balance, climate change is not good, right? If you said, like, would you rather have climate change or no climate change? I think just about everyone would say, well, no climate change. I mean, maybe, well, unless you lived in Iceland, in which case you're ready to go. None of those authors have bought property in Iceland, as far as I know. But given where we are today, it is true that change is going to cause disruptions, and the speed of the change is going to be faster than anything we've seen before, is what the science says. And if that's the case, that human civilization has seen before, and if that's the case, then we should expect the disruption to be proportionally larger than geological changes of the past.
I'm comfortable to say I'm a senior in life and not at Yale. I very much enjoyed your lecture. The thought is there's a lot of been focus on the fossil fuels and climate change. It's gotten more in vogue now, industrialization of animal husbandry and the animal production. What's your thoughts on that?
I know less about it. I think, there are two things to say about kind of, ultimately this is the don't eat meat question. Sorry, guys. As far as I understand it, there is one argument about carbon footprint associated that just takes more water and energy and everything else. It's really more about kind of ecological sustainability broadly. And then there's specifically a methane problem. I think those are both valid issues. I think when I talk about kind of big picture, the technological change that you're going to need to see, at some point we'll probably get to the point where it's like, well, what do you do about all that cow methane? But as a kind of share of the problem, it's a good example of like, let me find something to rail about that doesn't really affect me, that does not actually solve the bulk of the problem.
I'm a prospective student. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm just wondering what your feelings are on, well, sort of like more broadly, the argument about externalities in carbon emissions, and particularly the Obama era proposal of cap and trade, where that fits into the climate change debate as a whole.
Yeah, sure. So this is a very good question. There are two components to it. One is, how do we think about climate change as an externality? So even if we can't solve it, even if whatever else, well, if we can put a dollar price on it, then shouldn't you have to pay that price? And I think the reality is there are two problems with that. One, you can't put a dollar price on it. I mean, even just the range within the Obama estimates, first of all, what discount rate you choose turns out to affect more than what you believe about climate change. And then within the range of costs, there's no real kind of way to have any confidence that you're actually being efficient with what you're doing. The second problem is that if you actually want to be careful about externalities, you have to count all the positive externalities too. Somewhat in the US, but especially in the developing world, it's not at all clear to me that the negative externalities associated with climate change exceed the positive externalities associated with economic development and bringing heat and light and transportation to, let's say, rural villages. Then there's a third component, which is the air pollution associated with fossil fuels is a much bigger problem. And the developing world will take on fossil fuels to address air pollution long before they take it on to address climate change. But at the end of the day, I don't think, given that it will not actually address the problem, I'm very suspicious of it as a new way to kind of just add a new layer of regulation without any real precision. The second and related point, though, about cap and trade is I think it actually would be bad. Most of our policies that people like to talk about are aimed at raising the cost of fossil fuels, either to get us to use less or to induce the development of other technologies. The problem is that when you raise the cost of fossil fuels, you are inducing the development of technologies that are not actually cheaper than fossil fuels. And we've seen this at this point with wind and solar, which are in their third, fourth decades of subsidies. You can build a lot of wind and solar that way, but no one actually thinks that those are the solutions for the baseload in the developing world. And yet if you want to go make money in green energy, hey, wind and solar, right? So you can do cap and trade within the US and bring into the market a whole lot of stuff that could not compete on a level playing field with fossil fuels. But that's not actually accomplishing the technological goal of coming up with something better. So what I'd much prefer to see, instead of taxing 99% of the market, put some targeted subsidies in place for the 1% and say, look, when you're ready to bring something new to market, you get, say, a 10-year window of declining subsidies. So don't waste our time bringing something to market that has no viable path within 10 years. Don't do wind and solar again. But yes, we're going to help you get into the market, but your target needs to be things that are actually can beat fossil fuels.
Thanks again for your talk. So I'm going to proceed on the assumption that a lot of the climate catastrophism that's going on is coming from more of the left than it is the right. So I guess based on that assumption, what do you think the left gains to benefit from this kind of extremism? And would it be perhaps just like a better attempt at corporate regulation or something of that nature?
So, I mean, the politics of climate change is really interesting. It seems like the left loves talking about climate change, right? And this is their winning issue until there's actually an election. You would think if ever someone was really going to pound the table on climate change, it would be Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump, right? When better? But actually, she was in coal country talking about, all of the above energy policy. If you go back to 2012, President Obama did not endorse carbon tax, did not endorse cap and trade, did not talk about the Clean Power Plan. And MIT hosts a big debate every 4 years with representatives from both campaigns. I went and basically spent the 90 minutes just kind of teasing my poor counterpart about how he was saying these grandiose things about climate change and yet couldn't offer a single actual policy to deal with it. Because he was under strict instructions clearly not to say we should have a price on carbon, not to say we should still do cap and trade. And so as I said to the MIT audience, look, we are both only talking about technological innovation, so it's just a question of how you get that. So I don't think it is actually a very good electoral issue for the most part. The fact that you still hear it talked about a lot, certainly with elements of the Democratic base, it was certainly a bigger issue during the Democratic primary. But the activists on the left who are focused on this are not, generally speaking, mainstream Democrats. And their agenda is, I think, more kind of core environmentalism than conventional sort of liberal conservative regulatory state.
Hi, really enjoyed the lecture. I had a question about, so do you think there is any type of bipartisan legislation that we can pass that addresses the extended effects that you mentioned, that, we can't deny that there's some effects, but that also doesn't really hurt the economy, because we also can't deny that fossil fuels really run most of our economy. So do you think there's any type of legislation that both sides of the aisle can agree on?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. I think one is better technology policy. I mean, the Trump administration a couple of times has tried to wipe out funding for things like ARPA-E, which is kind of like DARPA, but for energy. And Republicans in Congress have put it back in. I think there's, potential interest in finding ways to expand that further. I would love to see it paid for by not spending the money on wind and solar subsidies anymore. As with most things in Washington, when you get to the pay for is when the consensus falls apart. But there is actually a lot of bipartisan enthusiasm for the technology. And then on the incentive side, things like our national flood insurance program, which kind of came into focus after Harvey. There was actually a pretty substantial effort last decade to reform it. Basically, just sort of to back up a little bit, if you own coastal property, you can, under certain conditions, get subsidized federal insurance, typically if you've owned for a long time or it's a very old house. And the idea was to sort of phase that out and let's get everyone up to paying market rates. And that actually passed. And everyone was very happy until it bit for the first time and people started to see their rates go up. And then everyone flipped out and it got repealed. And that's not left-right, that's just provincial political interests. But that's another area where rational incentives for private sector investment in coastal areas, requirements of flood-resistant and storm-resistant building codes, those kinds of things, I think there's actually a lot of potential bipartisan interest in. The problem is, and this is not exactly a partisan comment, but those on the left will consider this comment unfair. The left prefers to have this as an issue, or Democrats prefer to have this as an issue on which Republicans are not compromising. And so you will often see what could move forward as a compromise bill, then laden with a bunch of things that people are not going to go for. So like, let's not change our infrastructure review process to make it more efficient, but make sure it considers climate change. Let's just layer an additional climate change review onto all infrastructure, right? And you're a lot less likely to get the right to go along with that. So I do think there are areas where ultimately you'll see bipartisan interest, but it will require both some folks on the right to decide that that is better than just covering their ears, and some folks on the left to decide that is better than just yelling at the right for covering its ears.
Hi, you've mentioned a few times about how investing in renewable energies doesn't seem like a reasonable solution to dealing with climate change, but you've also mentioned that we should be investing in technology. What exactly do you mean by that?
With renewable energy versus technology?
Yeah, so you suggested a few times that in the solution to dealing with climate change, we should be investing in technology. Like, what does that actually mean? So
I think, renewable energy is exactly the kind of technology we should be investing in. But first of all, let's be clear, the renewableness of the energy is not what we care about. We're not concerned about running out of resources. The zero carbonness of the energy is what we care about. So any plan that does not treat nuclear as an exciting and important component of a solution, I think is not especially serious. even to some extent plans that don't focus on natural gas, which has carbon emissions, but only about half as much as coal for a given unit. So encouraging the development and deployment of lower carbon energy technologies is exactly what we should be doing. But when we subsidize and incentivize new research and development, it should only be in technologies that could actually be better than fossil fuels. Most of our effort right now is solar panel farms and wind turbines. And there are places where those are good, but those are not the solution. Those are not going to be the base load in the developing world. Just on land use alone, they start to get limited. And so whether it is renewable energy or other technology, we should sort of be agnostic as to what reduces the carbon emissions, and we should be focused on things that are actually going to be economically attractive on a plausible time frame.